Hello, welcome back to the Deep End Sports Science and History. I'm back again this time with it's a mixture of both actually. We're going to talk about the history of blood boosting in sports. So, kind of starting with blood doping, which would be blood transfusions. It goes back further than you think. So, as early as 1947, military research scientists were studying ways to increase fighter pilots' tolerance for hypoxia at high altitude. Makes sense. One such study, red blood cells were transfused at 10 mils at the US Naval Research Facility, and it increased oxygen carrying capacity. So, brilliant, it works. Now, when you try and do the deep dive on this sort of thing, trying to figure out who was the first athlete to actually do blood transfusions or later on any type of doping stuff, it's all shrouded in secrecy. So, the first one that I can find that's kind of on Wikipedia and relatively is a four-time winner of the Tour de France in the 1960s. Happened to be French, and his name was one of the first cyclists to use this technique. If you recognise Jacques Anquetil, a bit of a legend, also known for doing lots of other drugs at the time. Men, back in those days, people were using central nervous system stimulants, speed, or methamphetamine, whichever one you want to call it. They had lots of different names. It was a holdover from the Second World War when people that did military service were given amphetamines as part of just staying awake for a really long time. And you hear lots of different funny stories about soldiers being crash landing in the Sahara and then just taking a handful of speed and then walking their way out of the desert. Another one's a Finnish soldier who came under fire, took all of his company's speed, and then went on 12 hours by himself skiing. And then turns out everybody else was fine. It was actually just a problem. Well, it was a mistake. And he just went crazy and just did a lot of speed. Blood doping, it's a lot more involved than just taking a tablet. So probably, we're pretty sure it started in the 1960s, but it wasn't outlawed until 1986. So people could do it just fine if you had the medical facilities and somebody that would actually support it, because this is not something you can do on your own. Um, oh, who used to write for Sonia Deville, known as the Cobra, who tried to do it on his own and almost killed himself because hadn't refrigerated his own blood at the right temperature. Crazy kid. I think he runs an ice cream stand in Italy now. So while technically it was legal, it was commonly used by middle and long distance runners. We've got a couple of likely lads here. And so the first known case of blood doping occurred in the 1980 Summer Olympics in Moscow with Carlo Maaninka, Finnish guy. So I've overemphasized the Ma. And he was transfused with 2 pints of blood before winning medals in the 5 and 10K track races, though it wasn't against the rules at the time. And you can actually see him here. He's with Lasse Viren, who has admittedly always denied that he ever used blood transfusions, but pretty much everybody else seems to think he used blood transfusions for his double double, where he won the 5 and the 10K in 1972 and 76. So take from that what you will. He's never confirmed it, but people were using blood transfusions through the 60s and the 70s, and it was, well, relatively common at the very top end, but you always needed to have somebody who would perform the transfusion for you, because it's just not something you, even like a coach wouldn't be able to do that for you either. Apparently, Joop Zoetemelk admitted to receiving blood transfusions in the 1976 Tour, where he finished second, although he did claim that these were intended to treat his anemia rather than enhance his performance. Yep. Same year, Francesco Moser used blood transfusions to prepare for a successful attempt to break the hour record. Blood doping finally banned by the International Olympic Committee in 1985, but there was no test that existed for it. They just banned it. So technically banned, but if you had the facilities, athletes were still doing it. So the most famous case of somebody using a homologous, whatever, blood transfusion, allogenic, was Tyler Hamilton in cycling. Now, it was kind of funny because it was first caught in the 2004 Olympics where he won the time trial. And he was caught with different red blood cells mixed within. It was the first time I had this test available to sports. Apparently, it's actually a relatively common, well-used test in new mothers to see if there's blood mixed between her and her baby. So it's a relatively robust method. But his lawyers tried to claim that he could have a vanishing twin. The idea of a vanishing twin is that in the womb you were twins, you reabsorbed the other twin, so not identical twins, but fraternal twins. And the idea is it's very, very rare. It does happen where some people will have mixed blood types, but obviously that didn't hold up to any scrutiny because you can test for that relatively easily. So one of my favorite ones by 2007 was Alexander Vinokourov in the Tour de France, where he managed to crash out, got really badly hurt, and was like covered in gauze and bandages and stuff. And then he went and won the stage into Albi and then the time trial the next day. Apparently, the evidence showed that he had the transfusion was probably from a male relative. They can tell these sort of things when they look at the DNA. And his reply was actually pretty funny. If I had used my father's blood, I would only test positive for vodka. Made me giggle. So, actually, that case is an outlier. So, after the test in the 2003 2004, athletes moved back to autologous transfusions. This made things a lot less convenient because whenever you draw a couple of pints of blood, you then have this refractory period where you just can't train very hard and you certainly can't raise. So you have to set up a system of taking blood out, recover, then reinfuse that blood so then you have extra. And the funniest one with from Operation Puerto was Mario Cipollini, legendary cyclist, known as the Lion, dressed very flamboyantly, great sprinter. But apparently he used 23 blood bags in one season. So the way I've had it explained to me, obviously I've just took an interest in this, I've got no experience of it. You need to have a schedule of blood transfusions to make sure that they stay viable when they're refrigerated, because they have a shelf life. They don't last very long before some of the red blood cells start dying. So let's say of that 2 pints, say a litre, you might lose 40% of the red blood cells. So if you can reinfuse it and then you keep taking out good blood, chill that for a certain amount of time, then very complicated, and you need to have this schedule. And one of the problems with Operation Puerto was that they'd muddled up some of the bags, apparently because they tried freezing it as well. So the story from Tyler Hamilton was that he'd reinfused, I can't remember what day it was, but he'd reinfused and got really sick as he left and started peeing black, which is beautiful. So it's really complicated. So let's say you have 3 weeks in between each transfusion to make sure that on the day of your race, you're up to full capacity before the race, and then you can reinfuse an extra litre, meaning you have more oxygen carrying capacity. Not something that athletes or anybody can really do on their own again. So it's really only available to the richest athletes as well. So when we're on to blood transfusions, here we have Tony Romiga. There's a great video on YouTube if you Google this, and you can see his coach, or doctor, Sven Gali, Michele Ferrari, congratulating him at the end of, I can't remember which ride it was, but he managed to break the world record twice in 2 days because the story goes, apparently they managed to fill him with 2 people's worth of blood into one little man. So This was in the mid 90s when aerodynamics with Graham O'Brien and Chris Boardman were just the real height of things at the time. Now, it's pretty aero there, it's a pretty aero bike, but it really helps to have a shed load of extra blood inside you. So, yeah, we managed to break it really well twice. And you see Michele Ferrari jumping around on the track. Now, blood doping is very inconvenient, it has risks. So, sometime around maybe late 80s into the early 90s, EPO came into the pro peloton. There's some great story about it. Now, obviously, he was the most famous user of EPO in his triathlon days after he'd retired. Now, might be the most famous, probably not the worst or worst user of EPO. So I can remember sort of watching stuff when you watched what was it? Yeah, so early 90s when you're watching cycling, and I used to watch these videos on the Turbo all of the time, and Claudio Chiappucci, who by about 1990 was like nobody on the Carrera team, which comes in important. But on the Carrera team and watching him smashing his way away from everybody, and it seemed improbable. And turns out it was. He was one of the early adopters, along with other people on the Carrera team at the time. Which gets us to one interesting character, Francesco Conconi. Now, Conconi had listed subjects' names, gender, sport, date of analysis, as well as whether or not they were treated with EPO. Despite having funding by CONI and the IOC to come up with an EPO detection test, Conconi was using the money to buy the drug and then administered it to athletes who were also paying Conconi. Awesome. So he's said to have made a technique to balance EPO, blood thinner, human growth hormone in a mixture that athletes could take safely and pass doping tests without testing positive. With this ability to safely take EPO, a guy called Donati estimated that 60 to 70% of the peloton used EPO in the mid 90s. Especially when you get to something like the Tour de France, there was probably less than 1% weren't on EPO. Because if I remember, I pretty much trust that Chris Boardman probably wasn't, and a French guy called Christophe Bassons wasn't on EPO during the 90s in the Tour de France. And there's not many others that I would trust to say that they didn't. So Conconi was dipping at both ends, being paid to actually find a test for EPO, while also being paid by athletes for a drug and the method to avoid detection. Kind of genius. Evil genius, but genius. Here we have the Gewiss Balan team in 1994. And there's three of them managed to win, or they finished well ahead of the group in Flèche Wallonne. And Flèche Wallonne, I just saw it this weekend, this Wednesday actually, where Tadej Pogacar just rode away from everybody in the Mur de Huy. If you're not interested in cycling, generally, this was maybe one of the last times that it actually happened, where a breakaway goes away. Nowadays, everybody waits, and then it's only a few kilometers, but incredibly steep hill, and then it's a sprint up the hill. In this case, they managed to do a 3-up and just rode away from everybody with 72 kilometers to go. So the winner was Moreno Argentin, and you've also got Giorgio Furlan and Evgeny Berzin. It's particularly famous because it was quite an obvious show of doping, but also the team coach, Michele Ferrari, claimed that, EPO, it's no more dangerous than orange juice because you can have an overdose of orange juice. True. And it actually shows, when you see a lot of stuff about, especially the EPO era, you hear a lot of stuff about how athletes would have to have a heart rate monitor on their chest. And then if the heart rate got too low, they would have to get up and do exercise in the middle of the night to stop their blood from clotting because their blood was so thick with red blood cells. That may have been true, and then there's a couple of deaths related to this, but it's very hard. Unfortunately, one of the things that happens in sports is that sometimes young athletes just have heart problems. So it's really hard to link the use of EPO with those few deaths in the 90s. It's definitely possible, but it's also really possible that they just had some underlying heart condition, maybe exaggerated by the fact that they took EPO, maybe had nothing to do with it. Unfortunately, we just don't know. So I'm not actually prepared to say that EPO is this huge killer because, again, if it's used by under the supervision of a doctor that knows what they're doing, then it's probably relatively safe. One of the issues is that, yeah, just some Fred that orders it from the internet. Well, John Tiernan and Locke managed to do that and did very well. British cyclist, God, over 10 years ago now. But yeah, you can just, and it's reasonably safe, but obviously it's against the rules and it's really unfair. So here we get the 2000 Olympics. They introduce an EPO test for their games in Sydney. This was based on a complementary analysis using blood and urine. For this test, the blood screening took place first, followed by a urine test to confirm possible use of EPO. Now, this is the results from the road race with Jan Ullrich first, Alexander Vinokourov second, and Andreas Klöden in third. Now, all three of these have since been known to be reasonably consistent users of EPO for, I mean, certainly probably about a decade. Obviously, I talked about Vinokourov here, but Klöden got caught up in Operation Adalas. We have some Australian blood bank. So EPO test is useful, but testing just on the day is kind of useless. You have to be able to test the athletes out of competition because that's when you use the drugs to make sure you do the training. And most athletes nowadays are smart enough to not turn up to a big event like the Olympics or the Tour or whichever race while they're still glowing hot. What they do is they use the drugs in training months before the competition, and then they may actually be going faster in training, which is a thing that Lance Armstrong used to talk about. But you're able to do the drugs, which means that you have to do out of competition testing, which again becomes more expensive, blah, blah, blah. And in the next slide, we'll talk about what people are doing now, the anti doping authorities, to try and get around when people like this manage to win gold, silver, and bronze at the same competition while all riding for the same team. Unfortunately, it gets a bit more complicated.
With the complexity, we have to have what we now call the athlete's biological passport. The fundamental principle of the APB, or ABP, is to monitor selected biological variables over time that indirectly reveal the effects of doping, rather than to actually attempting to detect the doping substance or method itself. So this gets a little bit complicated. I'm going to try my best to explain it. You have a calculated score called OFF score, which computes the value of the hemoglobin level and the percentage of reticulocytes. Reticulocytes meaning new red blood cells, and it's used for detecting blood doping. So they look for changes in the number of red blood cells, the actual number, the percentage, new red blood cells, old red blood cells, and large enough fluctuations get flagged. And then normally the athlete is targeted for specific testing. Now, this is where the difficulty comes in. This is what this graph is actually showing you here. So here, up to 2002, the suspicious samples indicated EPO because you had a lot of new red blood cells. This is the green part here. But then the test comes in for EPO and it moves. So now you've got more old red blood cells, meaning that you're indicating that they've had a blood transfusion. Now, athletes biological ABP comes in in around 2007, 2008, and everything drops. That's an indication that a lot of the athletes are changing their behavior because the testing has got better. That's generally a good thing. So manipulating blood is very difficult to get away with, even if the parameters are pretty broad and thresholds for positive are necessarily high. Now, this is one of the difficult parts. The thresholds for actually getting a positive test via the athlete's biological passport are quite high. They have to be sure to 1 in 1,000. So normally, you look at like statistical probability. We go, oh yeah, a 5% probability is fine, or 95% confidence interval. This is much higher standards. So athletes, if they have enough money and they can test their blood, they have a little bit more wiggle room. But the whole idea of doing testing like this, and a lot of the drug testing, you're never going to remove cheating from sport, but you can just reduce its effect. So that hopefully, in the long run, clean athletes will be able to compete against people that are still trying to manipulate their blood or taking steroids or whatever. But the passport, as we can see here in this graph, did change the behavior of the athletes. They were doing, certainly not stopping doing all of the various stuff, because this was, if we remember, like Ricardo, Rico, and Leonardo Piepoli, they got tested with EPO, new variant EPO. People will still try, but this is the beauty of this is that it reduces the amount of doping, which also means that the effect of the doping is less too. Now, the interesting thing is what's happening now. So now there's probably some other drugs have hit professional sport, but that's for the next podcast. So hopefully, like and subscribe. I'm on Spotify, on YouTube, Instagram, blah, blah, blah. Like and subscribe, and I'll catch you next time. Bye.